he slapped her on their wedding night. The wedding was a picture-perfect event. Friends and family gathered in a luxurious hall adorned with twinkling lights and elegant decorations. Lila and David, the happy couple, danced hand in hand as guests cheered and raised their glasses to toast their union. Lila, radiant in her wedding gown, was all smiles, laughing as her new husband twirled her around on the dance floor. As the night wore on, the festivities gradually wound down. The last of the guests offered their congratulations, the music softened, and the couple finally retreated to their honeymoon suite, a stunningly beautiful room, designed to perfection. The soft glow of candlelight illuminated rose petals scattered across the floor, and champagne sat chilled on a nearby table. It was the kind of place Lila had always dreamed of, but as she looked around, she couldn't help but feel a sense of dread gnawing at the back of her mind. David, once charming and full of laughter during the celebration, had grown quiet. His warm smile, so dazzling during the reception, faded into something more sinister as they entered the suite. Lila noticed the shift immediately but said nothing. She already knew who David truly was, far better than he could have ever imagined. Sitting on the edge of the bed, David took out his phone, scrolling through pictures of the wedding day. Lila sat beside him, leaning over his shoulder, sharing in the moment. For a brief moment, it seemed almost normal, like the fairy tale image everyone else had seen. "Look at this one," David said, showing her a photo of them cutting the cake. Lila smiled, genuinely this time, even though her heart raced in anticipation of what was to come. Without thinking, Lila reached for the phone to take a closer look, but as she did, the device slipped from her hands. The phone fell to the floor with a hard crack. Lila froze as David's smile instantly disappeared, replaced by a look of pure rage. He bent down, picked up the phone, and saw that the screen was shattered. "You got to be kidding me," David muttered darkly. Before Lila could apologize, his hand shot out, slapping her hard across the face. The force of the blow made her head snap to the side, her cheek burning with pain. She stood there, silent for a moment, feeling the sting of the slap, but not from shock or fear. No, she had been expecting this, waiting for it, even. Slowly, Lila straightened, a small, knowing smile creeping onto her lips as she met David's furious gaze. He blinked, startled by her reaction. "What are you smiling about?" David barked, his anger still simmering. "Do you think this is funny?" Lila didn't flinch. Instead, she stared into his eyes, her voice calm and cold. "I knew you'd do this. I knew exactly who you were the moment I met you." David frowned, confused by her words. His anger faltered, replaced by suspicion. "What are you talking about?" Lila's smile widened. "It was time. You don't remember Precious, do you?" David's confusion deepened. He took a step back. "Precious? Who?" "My sister," Lila interrupted, her voice now hard as steel. "Precious was my sister." David froze, the name suddenly striking a chord. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but he said nothing. "You didn't know, did you?" Lila continued. "You didn't realize that the woman you married today is the sister of the woman you drove to her death." David took a shaky breath, the color draining from his face. "No, that's not possible." Lila stepped closer, her voice sharp as she began to recount the story that haunted her every waking moment. "5 years ago, you were married to my sister. You beat her. You broke her spirit. Every time she did something you didn't like, whether it was a small mistake or just because you came home drunk, you hurt her. Precious loved you, but you didn't care. You destroyed her." David's lips parted as if to argue, but no words came out. He backed away slowly, as if trying to distance himself from the truth. Lila's voice trembled with rage as she continued. "Precious called me that day. She was begging for help, but I didn't answer because I was at work. I thought I could call her back later. But it was too late. When I finally called, she was already gone. She killed herself because she couldn't take your abuse anymore. You murdered her as surely as if you'd put a gun to her head." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Her anger kept her steady. David, on the other hand, looked like a man who had just realized the ground was crumbling beneath him. "I came back for her funeral," Lila said, her voice quieter now. "You didn't even bother to show up. After that, I made a promise to myself. I was going to make you pay for what you did to her." David stumbled back against the bathroom door. I didn't know. I didn't know she had a sister." "Of course you didn't," Lila said, stepping closer. "I wasn't around when you married her. I was living abroad. But when I found out what you did, I swore I would come back and destroy you. And I did." The memory of Precious's death consumed Lila every day after that. Her guilt for not answering that call, for not being able to protect her sister, was overwhelming. But she didn't wallow in her grief. She left the country again, this time with a mission to transform herself. For 5 years, she trained. She learned how to fight, to become strong, to make sure that when the time came, David would never be able to hurt her or anyone else ever again. She had undergone facial surgeries to become a completely different woman, one that David wouldn't recognize when she re-entered his life. When she returned, she applied for a job at his company, positioning herself right where she needed to be. It didn't take long for her to catch his eye. David had always been attracted to beautiful women, and Lila, with her new face and newfound strength, was irresistible to him. She pretended to be the perfect girlfriend, all while planning her revenge. "And now, here we are," Lila said, her voice low and dangerous. "Our wedding night. The perfect ending, don't you think?" David's mouth went dry. His confidence, his arrogance, everything that had made him the man he was, crumbled in the face of Lila's revelation. "Lila, please. Please?" Lila's voice dripped with contempt. "That's what Precious used to say, too. Every time you hit her, she begged you to stop. But you didn't care, did you?" David's legs gave out, and he sank to the floor, leaning against the wall. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Lila stood over him, her anger burning hotter than ever. She could end it all right here, she could make him feel the same pain Precious had felt, but she didn't want him to die. Not yet. She grabbed him by the collar and dragged him into the bathroom. David didn't resist, he was too terrified to fight back. Lila, with all her years of training, was far stronger than him now. She slammed him against the wall, delivering punch after punch, each one fueled by the pain and loss of her sister. David cried out in agony, but Lila didn't stop until he was a crumpled, broken man on the floor. "I could kill you," she said, breathing heavily. "But I'm not going to." "You don't deserve that mercy," David whimpered, clutching his sides as blood dripped from his mouth. "Please. Lila." "No," Lila said coldly. "You're going to suffer, just like Precious did. And I'm going to make sure of it." For the next 3 months, Lila kept David locked in a small, empty room. She gave him just enough food and water to keep him alive, but every day, she would visit him and continue his punishment. She beat him, humiliated him, made him feel the same helplessness Precious had felt. Each time, David begged for forgiveness, but Lila remained unmoved. But then, one day, everything changed. On that day, when Lila entered the room, David didn't fight back. He didn't scream or plead. He just knelt on the floor, his head bowed, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, Lila. I know I can never make up for what I've done, but I feel it now. I feel the pain I caused her." Lila stood there, her fists clenched, watching the broken man before her. Something shifted inside her, a flicker of doubt, of hesitation. She had been so consumed by her hatred that she hadn't allowed herself to feel anything else. David's voice cracked as he continued, "I never wanted to be this way. My father, he used to beat my mother, and me. It was the only thing I knew. But I want to change. I don't want to be like him anymore. Please." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. This was the man who had destroyed her sister, the man she had vowed to ruin. But now, seeing him broken before her, begging for forgiveness, something in Lila began to waver. She had imagined this moment so many times, the moment when David would be at her mercy, as Precious had been at his. She wanted him to suffer, to feel the pain that had driven her sister to take her own life, but now, looking at him, a hollow ache filled her chest instead of satisfaction. David's voice was barely audible. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. But I can't live like this anymore. I feel the pain. I understand what I did. Please, just stop." Lila felt her resolve shaking. She had spent 5 years planning her revenge, had transformed her entire life around this moment. But now, as David lay broken and sobbing before her, she began to wonder if this was what Precious would have wanted. Precious had loved David once. She had believed, even until the end, that he could change. Lila remembered all the conversations they had over the phone. Precious never stopped hoping that David would somehow become the man she thought he was. That hope, though crushed by his abuse, had never truly died in her. Tears welled up in Lila's eyes as she stood over David. Her hatred for him still burned fiercely, but something deeper, a sense of guilt, sorrow, and exhaustion, began to take over. David, his head still bowed, whispered, "I wasn't always like this. My father, he was a monster. He used to beat my mother, and then he'd turn on me. I hated him. I swore I'd never be like him. But the anger, it took over. I became what I despised." Lila's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected to hear this, hadn't expected David to reveal the pain behind his cruelty. For so long, she had seen him as nothing more than a monster, a man who hurt women for pleasure. But now, in his broken state, he was showing a side of himself she hadn't anticipated. The cycle of violence had consumed him, just as it had destroyed her sister. "I'm not excusing what I did," David continued, his voice cracking. "I know I can never take back the pain I caused. But I want to be different. I want to be better. Please, just give me a chance." Lila stood frozen, torn between the hatred that had fueled her for so long and the small flicker of empathy that began to creep into her heart. Could someone like David really change? Was it possible that, underneath the cruelty and violence, there was a man who was desperate to escape the cycle he had been trapped in? She thought of Precious again, of how much her sister had loved David, despite everything. She had begged Lila to understand, to see that David wasn't just a monster. But Lila hadn't listened. She had been too angry, too consumed with her own guilt for not being there when her sister needed her most. Slowly, Lila knelt down in front of David, her eyes filled with tears. "You destroyed her," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You took everything from her. You made her feel worthless. And you almost took everything from me." David looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. I'll do whatever it takes." Lila stared at him for a long moment, her heart aching. She had every reason to hate him, every reason to finish what she started. But deep down, she knew that killing him, or continuing to torture him, wouldn't bring her peace. It wouldn't bring Precious back. "I don't forgive you," Lila said, her voice steady. "And I probably never will. But I'm done with this." She stood up, her body trembling with the weight of her decision. "I'm not going to let you take any more of my life. You've taken enough." David sobbed, collapsing onto the floor in front of her, his body shaking with relief and regret. "Thank you," he whispered through his tears. "Thank you." Lila didn't answer. She turned away, her heart heavy but resolute. As she left the room, she knew this chapter of her life was closing, but the wounds would take a long time to heal. She had spent years living for revenge, but now, she needed to learn how to live for herself again. Months later, Lila stood at the grave, her hand resting gently on the tombstone. It had been months since that night in the locked room with David, months since she had walked away from her quest for vengeance. The world had moved on, and so had she, at least on the surface. David had kept his promise. He had sought therapy, gone sober, and began working on himself in ways Lila had never imagined possible. She kept her distance, always watching from afar, waiting for him to slip back into his old habits. But he didn't. Slowly, day by day, he was becoming the man that Precious had once believed in, a man who wanted to be better, not for Lila, but for himself. As she stood there, looking at Precious's name carved into the cold stone, Lila's heart ached. She had spent so many years focused on revenge that she had forgotten what it meant to live. Precious had been the light in her life, and when that light went out, Lila had spiraled into darkness. "I'm sorry, Precious," Lila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I did what I thought I had to do. I thought it would make things right, but nothing can bring you back." She placed a bouquet of flowers on the grave, kneeling down to gently arrange them. "I hope, wherever you are, you found peace. I hope you're not hurting anymore." Lila stood up, wiping away the tear that had slipped down her cheek. As she walked away from the grave, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't healed, not yet, but she was on her way. For so long, she had been consumed by anger and pain, but now, there was something else, hope. Hope that she could move on, hope that she could live again, and maybe, just maybe, David could too. Months passed, and Lila and David's paths crossed again, but this time, it was different. They weren't enemies anymore, but they weren't friends either. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a fragile truce that allowed them both to move forward. David, true to his word, had changed. He no longer drank, no longer lashed out in anger. He had begun to rebuild himself from the ground up, piece by piece, learning to control the demons that had haunted him since childhood. He had even started volunteering at shelters, working with others who had suffered from domestic abuse, trying to make amends in the only way he knew how. Lila watched him from a distance, never fully trusting him, but no longer feeling the burning hatred that had once consumed her. She was healing too, slowly but surely. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was walking towards something better. And in the end, that was enough.